Hey guys, welcome to BudgetEDH. On this week's episode, we bring you Tinybones Trinket Thief at a $100 budget. One thing to note with this deck tech is Tinybones at the time of recording is over $50, so we'll be excluding the commander cost in this video in order to bring you a deck tech on Tinybones. Tinybones is 1 and a black for a legendary creature skeleton rogue out of Jumpstart. At the beginning of each end step, if an opponent discarded a card this turn, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. You can pay 4 black, each opponent with no cards in hand loses 10 life. All prices in this video are powered by TCGPlayer. If you guys are going to be shopping on TCGPlayer, it would mean the world to me if you guys would use my affiliate link, which I'll put up on the screen right now, and it will also be in the show notes down below. It doesn't cost you anything, but it does help the channel out quite a bit if you use that affiliate link. So Tinybones is a discard commander. He cares about your opponent's discarding cards. We're going to load up on all the best discard spells that we can at a budget. In addition, we want ways of taking advantage of when our opponents discard cards or are low on cards in their hand, so we do have quite a few discard payoffs in this deck. In addition, being mono black, we do have quite a bit of interaction in this deck. Then later on in the video, we'll go over some of the utility cards that we put into this deck that are going to help us win the game, and then we'll go over a couple of the win cons that we have in this deck. The main win con is going to be with Tinybones' ability that when our opponent's hand is empty, he's going to deal 10 damage to those opponents, giving him a way of closing the game out right on his card. Let's quickly go over the stats in this deck. So we have 11 ramp spells, 7 card draw spells, we have 6 pieces of interaction, and then we have 26 discard spells, and then we have 9 discard payoffs. These are cards that are going to help us win the game whenever opponents discard cards, which is exactly what we want to do in this deck. First up, let's go over some of the ramp that we included in this deck. Now, we do want to get Tinybones down on turn 2 always, so we don't really need ramp to get Tinybones out. But once we do have Tinybones out, we want to be able to chain discard spells together, and having some ramp is going to help us do that. If we're able to chain those discard spells together, we're going to be able to obliterate our opponent's hand, which is the name of the game with this deck. First up, we have Soul Ring. It taps to add 2 generic mana to your mana pool. We do have Wayfarer's Bubble in this deck. It's an artifact that you can pay 2 and tap it, sacrifice it, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, tap, then shuffle your library. Mind Stone lets us tap for colorless, or pay 1, tap it, and sacrifice it to draw a card. Everflowing Chalice is an artifact with multi-kicker 2. You can pay an additional 2 any number of times as you cast a spell. It enters the battlefield with a charge counter on it for each time it was kicked. And then add a colorless for each charge counter on Everflowing Chalice. Cold Steel Heart and Charcoal Diamond both enter the battlefield tapped, and they're both going to add a black to your mana pool. And then Prismatic Lens taps to add a colorless to your mana pool. Nyx Lotus is a new one out of Theros Beyond Death. It enters the battlefield tapped. Choose a color, add an amount of mana of that color equal to your devotion to that color. This is a really great card in monocolor decks. I try to include it in any monocolor deck that I have because of the power that this card provides. Solemn Simulacrum is a newly budget card. It just got reprinted in M21 and it's now under $2. So I do recommend putting it in your decks if you do have it. It's a great card to get you some ramp and some card draw. And then last but not least, we have a couple of cards that are going to accelerate us, not actually ramp us out, but Dark Ritual is an instant that adds 3 to your mana pool, and then Cabal Ritual does the same thing, but it costs 1 extra mana. The good thing about Cabal Ritual is it does have thresholds, so if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, you can actually add 5 mana to your mana pool, making it a little bit more powerful in that situation. Next up, let's go over some of the card draw that we have in this deck, and we don't have a lot. We only have 6 ways of drawing cards, but a couple of them are very powerful, and in addition, Tinybones also does draw cards whenever we make an opponent discard, which is very powerful. So first up, we have Sign in Blood, Night's Whisper, and Read the Bones. These are all going to let you draw 2 cards, and then you're going to lose 2 life. Read the Bones has the added ability of scrying 2. And then we have Asylum Visitor. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, if that player has no cards in hand, you draw a card and you lose a life. This is a very powerful card draw spell in this deck. You're going to be able to ravage the cards in your opponent's hands, so you will be able to draw quite a few cards off of this if it sticks around. The other cool thing about this is it does have Madness, so you can discard this to some of those discard spells that we have in this deck and get to play it for free, which is great. Guess Grimoire is another very powerful one in this deck, and it says whenever an opponent discards a card from his or her hand, you may draw a card. This is single-handedly the most powerful card draw spell that we can have in this deck, and it works out really well in here. And then We have Diabolic Tutor. It's not really a card draw spell, but it is going to help you find some of your more powerful cards in the deck, maybe like the Guest Grimoire that we just talked about, but it is a very powerful card to help you find cards in your deck. Next up, let's go over some of the interaction that we have in this deck. Now, since we're playing mono black, we can really only deal with creatures. So if your opponents play artifacts, enchantments, or anything else that we need to take care of, it's going to be difficult for us to take care of those things. So we're going to need to be able to play some politics with the table to get problematic enchantments and artifacts taken care of. We can deal with creatures fairly easily in mono black. So first up, we have Defile. It's an instant. Target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn for each swamp you control. Go for the Throat destroys target non-artifact creature, and Doomblade destroys target non-black creature. Then we have Murder. It destroys a creature. Force of Despair. If it's not your turn, you can exile a black card from your hand rather than paying the spell's mana cost, and then destroy all creatures that enter the battlefield this turn. This is a really good card if your opponents play multiple creatures in a turn. You'll be able to kill them all with Force of Despair, making it really powerful. Then we have Drag to the Underworld. The spell costs X less to cast, where X is your devotion to black, and it destroys a creature. All right, so let's get into all the discard that we have in this deck, and we do have a ton of discard spells to talk about. So first up, we have Funeral Charm and Raven's Crime. They're both a black mana to have a target player discard a card. Raven's Crime does have Retrace, so you can cast this card from your graveyard by discarding a land card in addition to paying its other cost. That's a nice added bonus on Raven's Crime. You can, if you keep drawing lands that you don't need, you can actually get rid of them and make your opponents discard. Vicious Rumors is a black mana, and it deals 1 damage to each opponent, and then each opponent discards a card, then puts the top card of their library into their graveyard, and you gain a life. Discard spells that hit all of your opponents at once are at a premium in this deck. They are the most powerful discard cards because we can hit all of our opponents at one time, making them very powerful. So next up, we have 3 creature cards that all have the same text on it. When they enter the battlefield, each player discards a card. These is exactly the type of creatures that we want in this deck. We want them to come in and make our opponents discard, and it hits all of our opponents, making them very good. And then we have Hidden Totorok. It's a very powerful card. Target player discards 2 cards at random. Then we have Small Pox. Each player loses a life, discards a card, sacks a creature, then sacks a land. This is a punishing card. It hits all players, including you. Your deck is set up to take advantage of discarding cards, and your opponents is not. Then we have Mind Swords. If you control a swamp, you may sack a creature instead of paying Mind Swords mana cost. Each player removes 2 cards from his or her hand from the game. This card does not count as discarding, so this will not trigger Tinybones, but it does impact our opponent's hand, which is exactly what we want to do in this deck. Next up, we have Delirium Schemes. Each player discards 3 cards. This is the best rate that you can get for opponents discarding cards in this deck. Mind Rake is a card out of Modern Horizons. Target player discards 2 cards, but does have Overload for 1 in a black. So if you pay this for 5, it'll make every player discard 2 cards. Dark Deal is a wheel in this deck, and it says each player discards all the cards in his or her hand, then draws that many cards -1. Plague Crafter is a powerful creature that when it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, and then each player who can't discards a card. So this is a very good card. You can play this card, sack it to itself, and then your opponents have to either choose to sacrifice a creature or planeswalker, and then if they can't, then they have to discard a card. So it's going to impact the game no matter what happens. Arterial Flow, each opponent discards 2 cards. If you control a vampire, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. The Vampire Clause isn't going to happen in this deck. We don't have any vampires in here. Cunning Lithiomancer is a creature. At the beginning of your upkeep, each player discards a card. This is a great creature to have in this deck. It's going to make all of your opponents discard a card at every one of your upkeeps, making it very powerful. Next up, we have Bottomless Pit. It's the same thing as Cunning Lithiomancer, except it's an enchantment, and it makes everybody discard at random instead. Necrogen Mist, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player discards a card from his or her hand. Oppression is similar, except that whenever a player plays a spell, that player discards a card from his or her hand. This can be a very punishing card. If your opponents are playing some sort of storm strategy, that's going to diminish their hand instantly with something like Oppression, and it's really going to cost your opponents a lot whenever they go to play spells. Next up, we have Pox. It's the bigger brother to Smallpox, and it's a sorcery. Each player loses a third of his or her life, discards a third of his or her cards in hand, then sacrifices a third of the creatures he or she controls, then sacrifices a third of the lands he or she controls. Round up each time. This card is extremely powerful for 3 mana. It's gonna really set the game back. Like I said, this deck can take advantage of discarding cards, and your opponent's decks are not going to be set up to do that. So it's going to set your opponents back to the Stone Age, and you're going to get some additional value if you have Tinybones on the battlefield with at least another creature, so you can keep it on the battlefield when this goes off. Unnerve is a sorcery. Each opponent discards 2 cards, and then Siphon Mind is one of the cards I really like, and I played in a lot of my black decks. Each other player discards a card. You draw a card for each card discarded this way. So your opponents will discard 3, and then you'll draw 3. It's a very powerful card for only 4 mana. It's great. Next up, we have Fell Spectre. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent discards a card, and then it also has a great text on there. Whenever an opponent discards a card, that player loses 2 life. This is going to give you some additional damage whenever your opponents discard a card. Rankle, Master of Pranks, is a creature I really like out of Throne of Eldraine. It has flying and haste, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, choose any number of each player discards a card, each player loses 1 life and draws a card, and each player sacrifices a creature. Now, these do go in order, so if you do choose all 3 options, your opponent's going to discard a card, but then they're going to draw a card, and then they're going to sacrifice a creature. Sadistic Hypnotist is a creature that you can sack a creature, target player discards 2 cards, activate this ability only anytime you could cast a sorcery. This is great for cashing in some of those rats and other things that you have that you don't really care about once they're hit the battlefield. You can turn them in and just have your opponents discard some cards. Next up, we have 2 of the most powerful cards in this deck. Painful Quandary is an enchantment. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, that player loses 5 life unless he or she discards a card. This is going to deal a ton of damage and ravage your opponent's hand whenever they cast a spell. It's probably the most powerful card in this deck, maybe tied with the next card I'm about to talk about here. And then the next card is Death Cloud. It's a sorcery. Each player loses X life, discards X cards, sacrifices X creatures, and sacrifices X lands. This is like Pox, but way worse. The more mana you have in this, the more punishing it's going to be. And this is going to really take a toll on your opponents when you play this spell. The downside to this is it also affects you as well, so make sure you are set up in a good spot when you do play this card, because it's going to have an effect on you as well. So next up, let's talk about some of the ways that we're able to win the game in this deck. Now, like I said earlier in the video, with Tinybones having that ability on him where he's able to deal 10 damage if your opponents don't have cards in their hand, we will be able to win the game that way, but we do want some ways of dealing some damage throughout the course of the game when our opponents have no cards in hand or when they discard a card. That's going to get the life total down lower. We don't want to just rely on Tinybones dealing 40 damage to each of our opponents. It's going to take quite a bit of time. So let's go over some of the discard payoffs that we have, and then these are going to help us win the game. So first up, we have Quest for the Nile Stone. It's an enchantment. Whenever an opponent discards a card, you may put a quest counter on Quest for the Nile Stone. This is going to get quest counters pretty easily. And at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if that player has no cards in hand and Quest for the Nile Stone has 2 or more counters on it, you may have that player lose 5 life. Shrieking Affliction is an enchantment. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if that player has 1 or fewer cards in hand, he or she loses 3 life. And then Liliana's Caress is an enchantment. Whenever an opponent discards a card, that player loses 2 life. The great thing about all these is they cost 1 or 2 mana, so they're super cheap to play. You can play this as early as turn 1 and really get the ball going and start getting some damage in on your opponents early in the game. Next up, we have a Planeswalker. It's Davriel Rogue Shadow Mage. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if that player has 1 or fewer cards in hand, Davriel deals 2 damage to them. And then it also has an ability on there, -1, target player discards a card. This is a very powerful card in this deck. It's going to really help us get some damage in on our opponents, and it also gives us ways of making our opponents discard as well. Megarim is just like Liliana's Embrace. Whenever an opponent discards a card, it deals 2 damage to that player. And then Wheel of Torture, during each of your opponent's upkeeps, Wheel of Torture deals 1 damage to that player for each card fewer than 3. Next up, we have Nezumi Shortfang. It's a flip creature. On its Nezumi Shortfang side, you can pay 1 in the black, target opponent discards a card, then if that player has no cards in hand, flip Nezumi Shortfang, and it turns into Stab Whisker the Odious. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, that player loses 1 life for each card fewer than 3 in his or her hand. Creeping Dread is an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, each player discards a card. Each opponent who discarded a card that shares a card type with the card you discarded loses 3 life. And then Raider's Wake is an enchantment. Whenever an opponent discards a card, that player loses 2 life. And then it also has raid. At the beginning of your end step, if you attacked with a creature this turn, target opponent discards a card. So next up, we're going to go over some of the utility cards that we have in this deck. And the first category I like to call keep your cards. And the first card that we want to talk about is Library of Lang. It's an artifact that gives you no maximum hand size. And if an effect causes you to discard a card, discard it, but you put it on top of your library instead of into your graveyard. So instead of discarding all those cards, you get to put them back on top of your library, which is really nice, so that you're able to redraw them if you want to. You do get to choose if you want to. Sometimes it might be better to just discard it and get rid of it if you don't need it. And then another card I really like is Bag of Holding. It's an artifact that whenever you discard a card, exile the card from your graveyard, pay 2 and tap Bag of Holding, draw a card, then discard a card, and then pay 4 and tap, sacrifice Bag of Holding, return all cards exiled with Bag of Holding to their owner's hand. This is a really great card. When you go to discard your cards, you get to put them under Bag of Holding, and then when your hand is empty, you can refill it all back up with Bag of Holding by sacrificing it, making it very powerful. Next up is a way of dealing quite a bit of damage to our opponents, which is something that we want to do. We want to get that life total down as much as we can, so that way we're able to use Tinybones' ability to close out the game in quick succession. So all these cards are going to help us deal damage to our opponents. So first up, we have Sir Conrad the Grim. Whenever another creature dies or a creature card is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or a creature card leaves your graveyard, Sir Conrad the Grim deals 1 damage to each opponent. You can pay 1 in a black. Each player puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. So this is going to deal quite a bit of damage whenever a creature card goes into the graveyard from anywhere, even if it gets discarded. This will deal the damage to your opponent. Grey Merchant of Asphodel is great in any mono black deck because it deals with devotion. So when it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses X life, where X is your devotion to black. You gain life equal to the life lost this way. The cool thing about this is it deals it to all your opponents, and you gain all the life that was dealt by this card, making it a very powerful card. Dread Presence is a creature that whenever a swamp enters the battlefield under your control, you can choose one. You can draw a card and lose a life, or Dread Presence deals 2 damage to any target and you gain 2 life. This gives you some incremental damage or card draw whenever a swamp enters the battlefield under your control. Thank you so much for watching our video today. If you like this video and you want to see more Budget Commander content, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And you can also check us out on patreon.com/BudgetEDH. There's a bunch of different tiers and ways to interact with us outside of YouTube. We'll see you guys next time.